Tonight on Primetime Politics, aggressive response.
We don't need it to be made in Canada. We'll have the jobs.
Our response, of course, will be firm and clear.
Steel and aluminum tariffs against Canada are set to take effect on March 12. Coming up, we'll speak with the mayor of Sault Ste. Marie about his call for aggressive counter tariffs to protect the local steel industry. Also,
we're stronger together. That's the message we want to deliver to the American people and to the elected officials down here.
Canada's 13 premiers are in Washington today pushing back against U.S. tariffs. What advice do their predecessors have for them? We hear from the former premiers of Ontario, Alberta, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Nova Scotia. And what can Canadian industries do to blunt the impact of the new U.S. aggression? The president of the Council of Canadian Innovators says it's time to focus on what the world wants and sell it to them. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Catherine Lafrance sitting in for Michael Serapio. Canada's premiers are in Washington to convince decision makers that tariff threats against Canada should be dropped. That trip comes on the heels of U.S. President Donald Trump's executive order to impose global tariffs on steel and aluminum, something he says is a matter of national security for the United States.
If it's made in the United States, there is no tariff. All you have to do is make it in the United States. We don't need it from another country. As an example, Canada, if we make it in the United States, we don't need it to be made in Canada. We'll have the jobs. That's why Canada should be our 51st state.
Tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum would be entirely unjustified. We are the U.S.'s closest ally. Our economies are integrated. Canadian steel and aluminum is used in a number of key American industries, whether it's defense, shipbuilding, manufacturing, energy, automotive. Together we make North America more competitive. We will be working with the American administration over the coming weeks to highlight the negative impacts on Americans and Canadians of these unacceptable tariffs. But we'll also be working with our international partners and friends. And if it comes to that, our response, of course, will be firm and clear.
So, as the Prime Minister promises to work with the U.S. administration and with Canada's international partners to highlight the negative impact of these tariffs, let's look at the impact on Canadian producers. Sault Ste. Marie is home to several steel plants, including Algoma Steel, one of the largest production facilities in the country. It employs thousands of people in northern Ontario, and the city is also closely tied to the United States, situated along the Canada-U.S. border and just across the St. Mary's River from Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Matthew Shoemaker is the mayor of Sault Ste. Marie. Mayor Shoemaker, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So what will this tariff mean for your community? Do you have any sense at this time how many jobs may be lost and the downstream effects this tariff will have on your city?
Yeah, well, you know, as it relates to job losses, I think that's for the company to figure out whether or not that there will be any impact on the jobs. But the reality is there will be dollars taken out of the Sault Ste. Marie economy as a result of this. We had steel tariffs imposed on Canadian steel in 2018, 2019 during President Trump's first term. And the reality of it was almost, it was hundreds of millions of dollars out of the local economy. And so that meant hundreds of millions that wasn't being spent on things like local restaurants, groceries, tourism dollars that weren't being spent. So there will be a downstream effect on consumer spending locally because of this.
Okay, speaking of 2018, were there any lessons learned from that experience that may help you this time around?
Yeah, there were. And what really seemed to break the logjam in 2018 was when the counter tariffs were imposed, targeted at legislators who had the president's ear. So that is what we as a community, and I think the industry is hoping to see from the federal government, of course, they've been relatively quiet on what the proposed response is going to be, only that they would come up with a proposed response. We want to see a targeted, aggressive counter-tariff response on products and materials that will focus in on districts that the president needs, that the president's base is in, so that those people, those voters and those legislators can talk to President Trump and try and get him to change course on this.
Okay. Beyond imposing retaliatory tariffs, is there anything else you'd like the federal and provincial government to do to help the situation?
Well, what they did last time when there was steel and aluminum tariffs imposed was they invested heavily in these companies to make sure that they could be ready for the next attack, and unfortunately that's come sooner than any of us expected with the second Trump presidency. But they invested hundreds of millions into the steel plants at Stelco, at Dofasco, and here at Algoma Steel to make sure we transitioned from a coal-based steelmaking to an electric-based steelmaking. Unfortunately, that transition isn't quite there yet. We're kind of halfway through the process now, where we've got all the legacy costs of the coal-based steelmaking and all the upstart costs of the electric steelmaking. So we're kind of in the middle of a river, not close to either shore at this point. And we need to get to the other side until we can be kind of on secure footing. And this is really throwing a wrench in those plans.
You're surprised by how quickly it happened?
I am, because, what we were expecting from the federal government last week was a 30-day pause on tariffs, and we were preparing for broad-based tariffs across the Canadian economy. We got reprieve from that last Tuesday or Monday, I think it was. And then, less than 6 or 7 days later, the goalposts moved, and suddenly we're facing down steel and aluminum tariffs that will hurt Sault Ste. Marie's economy disproportionately to how the kind of broad-based tariffs would have impacted the whole country. So now we are kind of in this fight with a few other communities, Regina, Hamilton, and communities in Quebec that produce aluminum. But we are still encouraging the Canadian population to buy Canadian, to make sure that that sense of patriotism that flared up last week is still there, and that people understand that the threat on these communities is a threat against all of Canada.
All right. What are you hearing from residents of your town, people who may be employed directly or indirectly by the steel industry? Are people worried?
Absolutely. It's a lot of anxiety, a sense really of betrayal, as you noted in your opening remarks. We are on the American border and they are on the Canadian border. And there has been a 212-year history of peaceful relationship here since the War of 1812. And all of that, I think, is under threat right now because there is a distrust of the American government from the part of Canadians, and there is an unwillingness to engage with our neighbors across the river and further afield the way we have historically. There have been, the history of our community is one where Canadians go across and treat Sault, Michigan like part of our own community, and Americans come across and treat Sault, Ontario as part of their own community. So that sense of, one community across two nations, as we've called it, is really frayed and at risk of being broken.
Yeah, and maybe not forever, but for a long time.
For a long time, and we faced this separation during COVID where people couldn't cross the border. Of course, during that period, it was because of the public health emergency, but the border was practically shut down for everyone. And there was, great disappointment and a sense of loss of neighborhoodly relations because of it. And here we are facing something similar this time because of the irrationality of the American government.
Right. Do you have some confidence that the tariffs will, again, this time be temporary, since knowing that they'll harm American companies and workers as well?
Yeah, I think what it doesn't give me comfort, but what is the reality of these tariffs is that they are the Trump tax increase on American consumers. They will cost Americans more money out of their pocket every time they buy a Tesla, which Algoma Steel goes into, every time they buy a hot water tank, if they're a new first-time home buyer. This will increase prices on American consumers. The aluminum tariffs will increase the price of a beer can. And so every time an American buys one of these products, the cost will be higher because of what the federal American government is doing. So I am confident that the more the pressure is applied to the American consumer, the more there will be the willingness on that part of the American federal government to back down.
All right. Mayor Matthew Shoemaker, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Canada's 13 premiers are in Washington for 2 days, where they will make the case to U.S. lawmakers that the 25% tariffs proposed by the U.S. president will be harmful to the economies of both countries. Here's Ontario Premier Doug Ford speaking to business leaders at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Let's stop wasting time and energy and effort fighting each other, threatening tariffs that will only hurt workers, hurt businesses, and cost more for families, hurting hard-working people just looking to get ahead in life. Instead, let's focus on restoring the pride of Made in the USA and Made in Canada. Let's be unapologetic as we stand up for American and Canadian workers. Today, let's usher in the new American and Canadian century, a new golden age. Let's build Fortress Amcan.
That's Ontario Premier Doug Ford making his speech in Washington as U.S. President Donald Trump's shifting tariff threats continue to dominate Canadian politics. On February 3rd, Canada had secured a pause of at least 30 days on broad-based tariffs. CPAC's Michael Serapio has been asking former premiers what Canadian officials should be doing in this 30-day period. Here's what they told us last week.
How do you think Canadian officials, federal, provincial, how do you think they should be using this period of pause before we kind of come up with some type of action?
Well, I believe, and I know that this will be the case. There's no time for making an assumption that this is over. I think that this 30 days has to be used to make sure that we have a very coordinated plan for what happens after the 30 days if the threat of the tariffs comes back. That is the work that needs to be done now. And to my point about coordinated response, I think that these 30 days should also be used to make sure that we have everybody in the tent, so that if the threat does come back, there isn't a scramble to get everyone on the same page. We really do have to be Team Canada. That can't just be a slogan. It has to be the reality of how we approach this very unpredictable president.
When it comes to advice for government leaders, federal, provincial, territorial, what would your advice be to them in this moment as they try to deal with the Trump administration?
My advice would be to stay in close communication with each other, to make sure that information was shared, to make sure that whatever proposals are bubbling up in our own bureaucracies in province and territories, that we share those, that we see if we can find common ground in terms of the strategies that we put forward, and make sure that we, as I said before, that we're on the same page and that we're supporting the federal government in their attempts, and that we communicate with the federal government, because that nobody wants surprises in a situation like this. We all want to know what each of us is going to be saying, so that we can have a coordinated approach.
So how do you want officials here in Canada to use this 30-day pause? What's left of it?
Well, what we better not do as a country is go back to sleep. What the crisis with the Trump administration has underscored is how vulnerable we have become as a country. We took for granted our privileged access to the world's largest economy through NAFTA. We can't take that for granted any longer. We took for granted the need to be productive. We've seen this 2-3 decade long decline in our productivity. We're now going on 3 years with a steep decline in per capita GDP, which is our wealth. We just got a kick in the pants this past week with the Trump tariff threats. Let's use that to fix our own internal problems that are holding back Canada from a more prosperous future. A lot of people, of course, I've talked about energy infrastructure. That's absolutely critical. Getting our tax system back to attracting rather than disincentivizing investment and savings and work. And finally, it means, as many have commented on, achieving the dream of the economic union in Canada by knocking down the remaining barriers to interprovincial trade and mobility in goods, services, and labor. A lot of that is a boring, grinding piece of work, which is regulatory harmonization. Nobody's ever going to win a vote or an election promising interprovincial regulatory harmonization. It's a very wonky issue. But there's one thing we could do to get big gains on that right away, which would be an agreement between the provinces to recognize each other's regs. So you would have a reciprocal recognition of all the provinces' regs of professionals, labor market, transportation, you name the industry. There might be some things where you have to allow for exceptions, but they should be very rare. And we need to get cooking with gas on that.
Now, before you and I are done, Mr. Dexter, I also want to get your thoughts on the threatened Trump tariffs. We now have this 30-day pause while Canada meets some of the demands being made out of Washington. I'm wondering what you think Canada should be doing during this 30-day period as we possibly look at the tariffs finally being installed.
Well, this has been said many times, and it's often been ignored, which is we should be diversifying our markets, and we should not be hostage, to a single country. And we negotiated and signed the Comprehensive European Trade Arrangement now some years ago. I don't believe that that has been treated with the seriousness that it needed to be treated with on either side, either from the European side or from the Canadian side. But obviously, there is another market in Europe for Canadian products, especially in Atlantic Canada, where it's a much nearer market for us, but it needs to be. We just need to diversify that market to the extent that we can, and some serious attention has to be spent with it. I know there are those out there who will say that it's a pipe dream to think that you're going to be able to diversify enough to be able to significantly wean the country off of its dependence on the U.S. But that doesn't mean there will always be a great volume of trade across the border. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't take every protective measure we can to not find ourselves in the position that we're in now.
Diversification, regardless of what we do, will be the lesson that we will take from this current trade and tariff dispute that we're seeing with the U.S. I think there's a lesson for us to learn, and we should not forget those lessons, but yet continue to work very closely with our biggest and best trading partner, that being the United States. It is not always as simple as one might think either. It's just where we are, the cost of getting goods to the new customer or the new country, as an example, will be difficult. So security issues will also come into play here, sometimes even just legislation. So we've had a good relationship from the U.S., but we've learned a lesson now based on these last few months that we should never take that for granted. And if there are other markets out there that we need to exploit and work with, let's not forget the lessons that we learned in recent days.
CPAC's Michael Serapio in conversation with a number of Canada's former premiers. As you saw there, those premiers say it's time for Canada to diversify, with the discussion around trade being top of mind lately, thanks to U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff threats. Now, one group is saying it's not just the number of countries we have to expand on, but the products we sell. Benjamin Bergen is the president of the Council of Canadian Innovators, which represents some of Canada's fastest growing technology companies. He was at last week's economic summit hosted by Justin Trudeau. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before we start, I wanted to ask about the steel and aluminum tariffs. I know you represent mainly tech companies who are unlikely to be affected, but President Trump has said no exemptions and no exceptions. Does that worry you as we look to March 4th and the potential for broad-based tariffs?
Yeah, so, as you've correctly identified, I do work predominantly with, scaling technology firms that are not in that space. However, I think that, what we're experiencing right now from President Trump is, continuous threats that impact, the entire Canadian economy. And regardless of which industry is being targeted, this is a wake-up call to us as Canadians that we've got to figure out some of the economic insecurities that we may have developed over the last number of decades, and need to be really strongly considering how do we actually not just expand our market exports elsewhere, but how do we actually diversify the goods and the actual services that we have, so that when we find ourselves in situations like this, we're a lot more resilient economically.
Wake-up call for American citizens too, maybe. Prime Minister Trudeau said the plan is to inform American officials of the inflationary impact of these tariffs, and if that doesn't work, to have an aggressive response. Should the Canadian government wait to retaliate or move quickly?
So look, I'm not going to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of what exactly the Canadian government should be doing in terms of direct response to President Trump and those tariffs. What I think we can do as Canadians more directly, and what Canadian governments across this country can do, is look at how do we actually build long-term economic wealth and prosperity. So there's obviously an immediacy that we need to deal with in terms of the Trump tariffs, and really figuring out the correct response there will be a collaborative approach between premiers and the Prime Minister. But where we at the Council of Canadian Innovators are really wanting to focus the light is how do we look at how we get out of this from a long-term economic perspective. Canadians are now 25% poorer than the Americans. We're now 20% poorer than the Danes, and we're 20% poorer than the Australians. And this didn't come about by chance. It came about by the fact that we didn't have a strong industrial strategy that understood how the 21st century economy was being shaped. So in this moment of a crisis where we find ourselves really concerned about our future, how do we strongly pivot and actually support the right type of public policy in the long run that will lead to wealth and prosperity and candidly higher levels of productivity for all Canadians?
Do you have the feeling that something's broken, because of those threats?
Broken in terms of President Trump's threats, or
in terms of relationship?
For sure. So, I think obviously the tenor and the manner with which they've been delivered, I think, has definitely caught Canadians off guard. But if you even look back at how CUSMA or NAFTA was being renegotiated, I mean, the way that things were created were to incentivize and to prop up American firms and to help support them here in Canada. And so we as Canadians, I think, have been playing a 21st century industrial strategy that doesn't understand where wealth and prosperity is created. So rather than actually building out areas where we can have real opportunity, right, whether it be in areas of cybersecurity or domestic cloud or other areas of defense, we've allowed ourselves to be sort of lulled by the Americans into this state. And so for us, the wake-up call is, President Trump is, barking orders and is, sort of levering, threats now and again. But the real response here over the long run will be how do we make sure that we're not in this type of economic situation again? And the response really is, what do open small economies do? What do firm or countries like, whether it be South Korea or Japan or Denmark or the Nordics do to respond to these types of economic reality? They figure out how to specifically look at where the innovation economy is going. They dig deep in terms of figuring out, where they've got some real strengths, and they work with their domestic innovators to build products and goods that are needed all over the world.
All right. Something else I wanted to ask you. At last week's summit, the Prime Minister was caught, if you remember, on a hot mic saying President Trump wasn't joking when he was talking about annexing Canada and that he's interested in our critical minerals. Trump has since confirmed that he is serious. What was the reaction in the room?
So I think, overwhelmingly, those are, big concerns for Canadians, regardless if you're in that room or not in that room. And I think the way that we should be looking at this is how do we use it as an opportunity? I've come back to it, many times and so far in our, relatively short conversation, but we need to come up with economic strategies that protect Canadians, that grow wealth and create opportunity. And I think kind of getting constantly caught up in sort of the constant barrage of threats is actually helping to impede our ability to figure this out. Productivity and prosperity is a little bit like health. You can't just say, hey, I want to be healthy. You've actually got to begin to do some real steps to sort of improve your health, right? Whether that be, going for walks or eating right or, cutting out alcohol and sugary snacks. And that's sort of where we're at right now. Whereas I think we as Canadians have committed to wanting to be more prosperous and be more sovereign and to maintain our economic ability. And now we've got to do the hard work, right? We've committed to being healthy, and now we've got to begin to look at and examine where some of the real challenges have been over the last, not just 10 years, but really the last 25 years, where we haven't had the economic growth to the same rate as other countries of a similar size and around the world.
Okay, we still have a few seconds left. What kinds of products do you think Canada should be moving toward producing and manufacturing?
Yeah, so look, we've got some real areas in places like cybersecurity. Our Five Eye partners actually purchase 5 times more than our own domestic governments do on cybersecurity products. So in a world that is increasingly becoming insecure through cyber, wouldn't this be a brilliant place for our government to spend dollars purchasing domestic solutions to the very challenges that we face? And Canada is not the only jurisdiction that's facing this. Many others are as well. And we're viewed as good partners. We're viewed as good actors. And these types of products are in tremendous demand, not just in Europe, but in South America and other parts of the world. So the government can move really quickly to be able to not only provide better economic stability through cybersecurity tools, but then also help the companies that are building them here in Canada to then sell them to the world, building companies, building successful products, building things that are needed, that are not just oil and wheat and canola and other items.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's going to be all for this edition of Primetime Politics. I'm Kathleen LaFrance. For all of us at CPAC, thanks for watching.